Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Davide Stronati, and I'm the chair of the Committee on Engineering and Environment at the World Federation of Engineering Organization. And I will be the chair today for this session on implementing equitable, sustainable, and climate-resilient infrastructure and local adaptive capacity. And it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you today. And if you are following from the UNFCCC platform, do please submit your question in advance in the chat. So this event is organized by WFEO, which is the World Federation of Engineering Organization, the Committee on Engineering and Environment, which is hosted by the Institution of Civil Engineers in the UK and by Engineering Institute in Canada. And as the WFEO representative, I will take a few minutes to briefly introduce the organization. So the World Federation of Engineering Organizations was founded in 1968 with the support of UNESCO. And it wants to bring together the voice of engineering globally. We represent more than 30 million engineers in some 100 nations. And we have different committees, standard technical committees working on all the different branches of engineering. There are the logos of some of them, such as the CEE on environment and engineering, the young engineers, the energy committee, and so on. And so from this snapshot, from this map, you can see that effectively we are a truly global organization covering the vast majority of the countries. The Committee on Engineering and Environment specifically, it takes into consideration the SDG 13, the one on climate action. But it is unavoidable that we also relate more closely with the standard committees of WFEO, that they take into consideration energy, water, the infrastructure, and the resilient communities and cities. And so we cross-collaborate within WFEO to find solutions, engineering solutions that effectively they want to address not just climate change, but also climate change and water, climate change and energy, climate change and cities, and so on. At the COP25 in Madrid, we launched our declaration on climate emergency because effectively we recognized as well as an engineering community, and we've been hearing this for quite a while, that time for action is now. And so we wanted to bring our own experience and knowledge and 11 points manifesto on what the engineering community can do on the mitigation and the adaptation side. And so on this note, we are still asking member organizations to become part of this declaration of climate emergency. We have a good 40 members, and I would invite all of you to go on the WFEO website to see more in details what is the content of this climate emergency declaration. I'm really, really pleased to invite the first speaker of today. We're going to have 4 speakers. 3 are going to be present here in person, and one, I'm afraid, is going to be virtually only. But I'm really pleased that she was able to send this video where she will take us through the infrastructure, climate change, and building forward better. She is the Senator, Honourable Senator Rosa Galvez, and who is an environmental engineer, an independent Canadian senator for the province of Quebec, and president of the Parlamerica's Parliamentary Network on Climate Change. She was a professor at the Université Laval de Quebec, in Quebec, for over 25 years, and was also chair of the Civil and Water Engineering Department from 2011 to 2017. In 2016, she was appointed to the Senate of Canada by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, following a selection process by merit. She was sponsoring the Senate of the Canadian Net Zero Emission Accountability Act, which was adopted in June 2021 and was the recipient of the 2021 Clean 50 Award for her parliamentary work on environmental policy. So with this introduction, I would start the pre-recorded message from the Honourable Senator.
Thank you so much for having me today. I will be speaking about infrastructure, climate change, and building forward better from my perspective as both an academic and senator at the Canadian Parliament. So we are living concomitant crisis. We are in the climate change, we are in the waste and pollution of water, air, and soil. Our planet is warming and species are disappearing. In part is due to overpopulation and overconsumption, but also to our economic model, which is linear, take, make, and dispose. We have to move to solutions that works as an understanding in a holistic way, understanding of networks and factors of interactions, and passing by the adoption of new values of life in society. Climate change is here to stay. Canada is warming twice the average, and in our Arctic is warming three times the average. The climate change is caused by human activities, notably burning of fossil fuels. I wish I could say that Canada is a climate leader and that we are in track to attain our goals, past goals, future goals. Is not yet the case. However, there is hope. We passed last year the Net Zero 2050 Act, and we want to redress this situation. We still heavily relied on fossil fuels, and we need to change this. Every province and every territory has been hit by extreme weather events in Canada, and each of these events have been very costly in restoring, and many of them have not complete restoration. The financial world in Canada is threatened by this risk, climate-related risk, and which is growing in frequency and exponentially, and we need to manage this risk. As engineers, we need now to implement and live every day with following the approach of risk in order to assess exposure, assess sensitivity, increase capacity of adaptation, reduce vulnerability, and increase resilience. The two key words here are adapting and mitigating. Adapting to the climate change and extreme weather events that destroy basic infrastructure, and mitigate in reducing the emissions that our activities cause and keep putting greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. Some of the activities can do both at the same time, and we need to be efficient in that sense. There is a virtuous circle that starts with academics, with experts that develop units and infrastructures that has more robustness, and we need to put this information and this knowledge available to everybody. We have to increase the capacity to learn, and we need to become more resourceful. And this has to be transmitted to worker and to everybody, every professional that works with us. And of course, for this to happen, we need to have the appropriate allocation of funds and have the proper incentive and the financial arrangements in order to assume the risk that it's becoming very high. And sometimes this risk is uncertain. And of course, we need the governments assuming the role in putting progressive policies and processes for good governance and for increasing public security by promoting and implementing safe failure. As senator, I write my office edits several white papers. This first one concerns building codes. We need to have building codes available to municipalities, to engineers in municipalities, and we need that they are modernized in a more frequent cycle. You can learn more about this in my website. I have available copies in 2 languages, sometimes 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish, that is available to everyone. Another paper that we wrote was Building Forward Better, a Clean and Just Recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. As you know, the COVID gave us a lot of time to reflect on the situation. We know that the COVID didn't break the system. It just revealed a system that was not working. And this pandemic is a different crisis than the 2008 financial crisis, and therefore we need to tackle it in a different form. In this sense, in this white paper, we propose a clean and just stimulus that includes ways of implementing and improving and promoting clean energy and infrastructure investment, building efficiency and retrofits through building codes, investment in education and training, so making effective that virtuous circle that I just talked, and of course, put also money in research and development and of technology, because this is hardly needed. We need to go to a step away of only looking for benefits and profit. That model, that linear model, didn't work completely. We need to think in other core benefits, social benefits, environmental benefits, and health benefits, and therefore in this white paper we explore all these possibilities, plus from where get these funds to pay these programs. Finally, another paper that we wrote is the Aligning Canadian Finance with Climate Commitments. It's a legislation that I tabled in the Senate a few months ago, and this is why. This is because, as I mentioned, we need to align the funds. We have to allocate the funds because the technology we have, the knowledge we have, sometimes the political will is there, but still a major player is the finance sector that needs to align with our climate commitments. So this bill have 7 points of action. We know that directors have fiduciary duties, and in these fiduciary duties, we have to include the need to manage and this climate risk. The entities that finance projects, whether they are banks, pension plans, investors, crown corporations, they need to have also this purpose of aligning their flow, their funding, their loans, their financial products with climate commitments. And we have national commitments and international commitments. Among the international ones, we have the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework for Climate Change. And we have our Net Zero Act. Of course, this needs to be, very detailed, because we need to walk the talk, and targets need to be science-based, and plans needs to be detailed, and we have to report progress in order to know that we are going to attain net zero before 2050 or at the latest 2050, and we are not going to wait until 2049 to try to get there, because we know that that's impossible. One of the reasons because the financial flows are not in alignment with climate change is because there is no climate expertise in these decision tables, and there is several conflict of interest. When we have directors sitting at the same time in pension plans, in banks, and in fossil fuels board, then we cannot progress in the sense in the path that we want to take. I explained about this increasing cost in extreme weather events, and we need to have the capital adequacy to face this risk and these events. Of course, the government needs to align its financial products, even the advising and the loans and the investments with the climate commitments, and the Parliament needs to be aware of what is the progress being done. But I remain positive. Why? Because there is a sustainable revolution that is happening now. The revolution shares several features with the Industrial Revolution. It is organic because you have leader nations that are implementing policies top down, and you have grassroots organizations that are working bottom up. We need to also consider other indicators of well-being, of human well-being, and not just populations and GDP. We need to identify forms of modernization and development that are more sustainable, such as circular economy, net zero, zero waste, energy efficiency, and others. And science and technology are at the forefront of these changes, so all of you are there. So the final question is, are we going fast enough? Right now, the answer is no, but I really hope that if all of us works in order to push to go in the same direction, we will be. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be very happy to answer you either through Zoom or through my media. Thank you so much.
And I would like to thank you so much, the Honourable Senator. I think it was a great start of this session where we got passion, knowledge, expertise, and where we can see really what can be done at the policy-making level to address climate resilience in infrastructure. Our next speaker is here in the room. His name is Ignacio González-Castelao Martínez-Peñuela. And Ignacio is a dedicated master civil engineer skilled in the water cycle and environmental issues. He has worked in different private and public Spanish engineering organizations, both within the water sector and in infrastructure of roads and railways. Ignacio has held various positions at Aguas de las Cuencas Mediterráneas since August 2002. Currently, he is deputy to the CEO. Ignacio has been a member of the board of directors of the Civil Engineers Association of Spain and member of various committees of the Engineering Institute of Spain. He has served as chair of the Standing Group on Water of the World Federation of Engineering Organization and is currently the chair of the Standing Technical Committee on Water of the very same organization. So, Ignacio, I would invite you to come to the stage to give your presentation.
Well, thank you, Davide, for your kind words. Well, we are going to talk about climate change in the field of water and the different adaptation actions that engineering provides. These measures are addressed in a more extensive way in the publication of the image that you can see or that you can download from the WFEO website. Here, the blue sphere represents the relative amount of terrestrial water compared to the size of the Earth, an amount that has remained constant for more than 3 billion years. Of all the available water, global demand accounts for 5% of the amount of water in rivers and lakes, or 0.04% of total fresh water. 70% of this demand is for agriculture. The current status of water resources can be assessed through UN Water's monitoring progress on SDG 6 targets. The average of all these progress indicators is 53%. This means that we need to accelerate action as we are not yet moving at the speed and at our scale needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals set for water. This current situation is exacerbated primarily by non-climate factors, such as population growth or production and consumption patterns, and also the aging of some of our water infrastructure is also an issue to be considered. Climate change is an added problem to this current situation that will increase pressure on already stressed water resources. The degree of mitigation we achieve will determine the level and measure needed for adaptation. The more mitigation, the less adaptation. Also, never forget that beyond adaptation, there is only migration. The different climate change scenario expected simply indicate the speed at which we have to adapt. Adaptation is not only constrained by physical limits, but also by the limits of knowledge, governance, and finances. These three pillars are fundamental. In addition to scientific knowledge, it is necessary to recognize the value of other forms of knowledge, such as indigenous, local, or community science, to understand and evaluate adaptation process and actions. Engineering is the one who materializes knowledge, making it available to society and the environment. Governance should set clear policy and legal frameworks, promote behavioral incentives, and conduct inclusive and deliberative processes that reinforce adaptation actions. Globally, adaptation costs in the water sector will amount to $2 billion per year by 2050, which is almost half of what will be paid for tutor. Okay. Equity considerations must be integrated into financing. If this does not happen, the adaptation gap will continue to grow. We are all aware of the components of the climate system related to water cycle that are expected to change on a warmer planet. But what should be emphasized is that while climate trends are clear and also there indicates effects at a global scale, there are uncertainties when we downscale to a regional, local, or basin level. Therefore, the challenge is to know how to manage uncertainty at the local level, as it can affect territories and populations differently. The main adaptation measures have been grouped into three categories: those related to water supply demand, extreme weather events, and for sea level rise. The term demand should be holistic and also refer to all other living beings and ecosystems. It should not be forgotten that natural ecosystems are the basis of water supply. Under uncertainty scenarios, it seems reasonable to first undertake those actions independent of climate change, or that generate co-benefits or even implement adaptation measures in a gradual or phased manner. These measures are referred to as no regret or low regrets in some bibliographies. Uncertainty related to future scenarios means that every effort should be made to adopt flexible or resilient approaches, focusing on short-term, low uncertainty actions. If we focus on the adaptation measures related to water supply demand, we can say that climate change will affect water supply in terms of availability, quantity, and quality. Demand will be affected mainly by world population growth and the consumption patterns of the current development models. The balance between a reduced supply and increasing demand can only be achieved through an adequate planning and integrated water resource management. 7 supply-side adaptation measures have been identified, and 5 demand-side adaptation measures are proposed. From the water supply point of view, we can say that with information analysis systems, greater knowledge contributes to better uncertainty management and decision-making. All these knowledge systems make it possible to transform existing river basins into intelligent river basins. The protection and conservation of natural ecosystems are fundamental for better quality and quantity of water resources. We must protect water at its source. These protection and conservation measures should be clearly incentivized to determine water prices and the strategic protections of land. Water losses reduction, Water losses reduction is one of the non-regret measures I referred about earlier. Globally, water losses in drinking water supply networks amount to 130 cubic kilometers per year, and evaporation losses in lakes and reservoirs amount to more than 350 cubic kilometers per year. Measures to improve drainage and sanitation networks, together with wastewater treatment, allow water to be returned to the environment in an acceptable condition of quality. Sustainable urban drainage allows also surface runoff reductions. The improvement of these services is independent of climate change. Only from the point of view of human health and the environment, this aspect is a priority. Storage and regulation capacity is important to increase supply and make it available when demand requires it. Rainwater harvesting, wetlands, reservoirs, and aquifers recharge are the main measures. Unconventional resources, such as atmospheric water capture, desalination, or reuse, allow the release of other resources and diversify water sources. Almost 2.4 billion people live less than 60 miles away from the coast, so it seems that desalination will continue to be an indispensable resource in the future. The linear model of water catchment, storage, transportation, potabilization, distribution, use, wastewater treatment, and discharge changes completely by including water reuse, generating a circular water economy that increases the capacity for sustainable adaptation. Space stations are the paradigm of reuse in the field of water to provide astronauts with this resource. More water should be reused than what we currently are doing, because there is a large circularity gap. Believe it or not, the same is true for the reuse of materials. Currently, only 8.6% of the world's materials are recycled. The last but not the least of the 7 supply-side adaptation measures is the transfer of resources between regions or basins. This transfer is also carried out through the import and export of products, goods, or services. We are talking about virtual water. Regarding demand-side adaptation measures, all of them are aimed at making better use of water resources. The implementation of awareness campaigns on sustainable water use, particularly in agriculture, is a task in which we all must be actively participate. Increased knowledge is essential for decision-making regarding the opportunity of water consumption. Other demand adaptation measures are those aimed at increasing the productivity of the resource. This also includes the reuse of water in industrial process or even the exchange of water rights. The reduction of losses from a demand perspective is also relevant. The last measure, and perhaps the most important, are all those advances that make it possible to decouple development from the water use or disruptive changes that promote the less water consumption. These advances will release resources and ensure that water is not a limiting factor for development. These type of disruptive changes are the ones that lead to an increase in the planet's biocapacity. Usually changes follow technological breakthroughs, but in the case of climate change, the opposite is happening. Change is taking place first, and technological solutions are lagging behind. We are providing traditional solutions, and we need disruptive breakthroughs. Now we're going to talk about the adaptation measures for extreme weather events. Catastrophes are increasingly seen by society as the public face of climate change. Climate extremes cause extreme events, but whether a meteorological phenomenon is catastrophic or not does not depend exclusively on the extreme value taken by the climate element. Other factors, mostly caused by economic and social reasons, are the ones that can condition the catastrophic nature of an extreme phenomenon. Traditionally, these extreme events have been treated as an emergency or critical situation. At present, these policies are changing around the world, shifting from a crisis management approach to one based on risk-adaptive management. Structural flood risk measures range from flood abutment dams and embankments to levees and protection walls or sustainable urban drainage systems. Basins that host numerous flood protection infrastructures have in many cases lost the connection between rivers and floodplains. In these cases, it is important to recover, if possible, the natural rotation measures. Non-structural measures range from land management and urban planning to early warning systems and civil protection. Since 1970, 7% of all disaster events worldwide were drought-related. However, they contribute to 34% of disaster-related deaths, mainly in Africa. Addressing drought risk is based on the establishment of management plans and measures, drought control and warning systems. More details on this issue can be found in WFEO publication Best Practice on Droughts and Floods Management Engineering Contribution. The last measure addressed are those related to sea level rise. Given that sea level will continue to rise regardless of the mitigation measures undertaken, adaptation seems to be a priority. It should be noted that 10% of the world population lives between 1 and 10 meters above sea level. If we focus on small islands or atolls, it should be noted that in addition to facing rising sea levels, they are already facing water insecurity and will increase in the short term. Therefore, international collaboration to address climate change in these sites is essential. Climate change must be a shared change. Adaptive response can be categorized into 4 groups: coastal protections, advance, adaptation, and retreat. Usually, these measures tend to occur in combination with each other at the same coastal location over time. Hybrid coastal protection solutions combine structural and ecosystems-based measures can provide an effective solutions. Coastal protection measures may be cost-efficient for cities, but not affordable for rural or poor areas. Regarding coastal advance, globally, an estimate of 34,000 square kilometers of land has been gained from the sea in the last 30 years. Adaptation measures proposed are not only structural, but also those related to the establishment of new building codes, better planning, the development of forecasting, and early warning systems. Accommodation measures can be effective in places where smaller rise in sea level are expected. The last one, coastal retreat, is an effective solution but has a serious social and political problem. The adaptation measures I described bring multiple benefits, but we must build infrastructure from a different perspective that puts more value on the relationships with the rest of the stakeholders, such as the environment, which in the end is the one that provides us with the resource for our own survival. Therefore, the design phase is fundamental. We must design resilient and non-regret infrastructures, identify vulnerable areas, and testing our proposal for adaptation to climate stress tests. The circular economy of water is important, but it is also relevant to consider the life cycle of the materials we use, defining at the design stage the dismantling of facilities at the end of their lifespan and the possible subsequent use or recycle of these materials. Engineers must continue to be the actors of the change. We must collaborate in transforming the development model, supporting a shared change. Engineering must be the tool against inequality and poverty. We must contribute to a sustainable, intelligent, fair, and inclusive development. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Davide.
Well, thank you, Ignacio. I think, there's a common theme that I picked up, for instance, in the presentation of Ignacio and the Honourable Senator, which is the pace. I think both of them, they were talking about whether we are progressing with pace, and it seems that the answer is clearly not. But also what I noticed is that his presentation was really dense of information. And that's why in his structure about knowledge, governance, and finance, we need to work as engineers with the governance, politicians, and the finance to make, practical measures on how to address climate change. The next speaker, I'm really pleased to say, is here as well, and his name is Darrel. Danyluk is in the room. He comes from the Engineering Institute of Canada. And Darrel is a distinguished civil engineer in the field of infrastructure engineering. He is recognized for his contribution to engineering with specific emphasis on adaptation of infrastructure to the impacts of a changing climate. His leadership on climate impacts and on infrastructure issues included chair of the Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee, examining the vulnerability of Canadian infrastructure to the impacts of a changing climate, an initiative he has led since its inception in 2005. Internationally, he has served as Vice President of the World Federation of Engineering Organizations and Chair of the Committee on Engineering and Environment, 2007-2015, where he led the development of the Model Code of Practice, Climate Change Principles for Engineers, and the Model Code for Practice for Sustainable Development and Environmental Stewardship. Darrel, please come on the stage. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Davide, and welcome to everyone, both in the room and virtually. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to cut down to basics. You know, why do we need to adapt, and what do we need to be done? What do we need to do? Oops. We need to figure out how to use a computer. What did I do? That one. Okay. Thank you. I'm here representing the Engineering Institute of Canada, who is a federation, or which is a federation of engineering organizations, technical societies in Canada, and we represent approximately 30,000 members collectively that are across the in industry and governance across the spectrum. These engineers get up every morning, go to work, and work to ensure that the infrastructures that societies depend on, Canadian society depends on, are there to operate and provide that service. Why do we need to adapt? We've all read the papers, we've all seen the news articles, and the impacts of these severe climate events is significant today. But in the future, on the horizon, we're not exactly sure what that's going to bring to us. It's something that we do need to address, and the question is, how are we going to address it? I could have chosen many different climatic-related disasters, events, and I chose fire, because fire is something we see on the news, specifically from California. Every year they have drought, they have fires, and it's significant impacts. In Canada, over the last 10 years, we've had 3 major fires, 5 years apart, 5-year return cycle, where a community has been devastated. This is the aftermath of these fires. The community is gone. And what does that mean? It means climate change, adapting to climate change is about people. Every day when there's a significant event, people at the local level are impacted. And we need to recognize that the speed that we adapt our infrastructures to be able to minimize the impact benefits those people. Setting policies needs to be done. Setting goals and arranging financing needs to be done. Mitigation is at the global level. Adaptation is at the local level. So why do we need to adapt? And basically what I've just summarized is it's to maintain the quality of life of these people, improve the standard of living of those people in developing countries. And how do we define quality of life? Well, it's the human elements, the social fabric of society, and it's how it interrelates with our infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, the built infrastructure, the ecologies, nature, the social networks, and the economic infrastructures. And by human elements and social fabric, what I mean is it's how we as a society, whether it's in a community, a big city, in a country, it's how we live, how we work, how we play, entertain, eat, create wealth, interact, travel, communicate. And it's all in relation to the community and our impact on the environment. The Framework Convention on Climate Change Global Goal and Adaptation highlights, features 3 core components: enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change. All these things apply globally, nationally, and specifically to the local infrastructures. In the shorter time frame, and this ties right in with what was said earlier, in the shorter time frame, we need to adapt our existing infrastructures to address these increasing frequency and increasing intensity of extreme events. And there's an engineering perspective on this. Our existing infrastructure was built using codes and standards that had climate criteria in it that no longer applies. It no longer applies. And it takes time to change codes and standards. So we need to use professional judgment of the best people available in engineering, in climate science, in risk management, in operations, in maintenance to make decisions at the local level to mitigate the impact of infrastructure. When we do this, we should ensure that the work that we do is equitable, sustainable, and is climate resilience. And by equitable, it should provide accessible and safe services, whether it's water-related, wastewater-related, transportation, communications. It needs to be sustainable and minimize the impact for the design life of the infrastructure. And the design life is an important factor in considerations of existing infrastructures. Where in its life cycle is it? If you're making decisions, allocation of resources, and a particular kind of infrastructure, although vulnerable, is near the end of its life cycle, then you have to do a risk assessment to decide, is it worth investing in this to upgrade and build resilience, or is it better to wait the 3, 5, whatever time frame it is, and then build it into the new or the upgrading system. This particular slide shows there's an interrelationship between infrastructures. If you've got a hydro plant providing electricity to a city, the city depends on that electricity. If the electricity goes out, there's no electricity at the power generation plant, at the water treatment plant, and the water goes out. So a failure in one could lead to a failure in another. And in the bigger picture, if it's a hydro plant, the drainage basin considerations and availability of water is real. And you're probably all aware of what's happening with Lake Mead in the United States and the severe low levels there. Infrastructure assets must be sustained and last anywhere from the 25 to 100 years in their life cycle. Failure, 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 failure. When you look at all infrastructures, and there's 6 of them shown on my left-hand side, and then you look at the 5 events across the top, all of those extreme events can cause failure in these major transmission lines, and if you in these major infrastructures. And if you have failure in a power line, transmission line, it shuts down all the electrical system. And just recently in Ottawa, in Canada, major windstorm. It was sort of a lineal tornado. Roofs torn apart, power was off for a significant amount of time. You can go to any country in the world and this same slide would apply. The potential for failure or actual failures is happening, it's happening now. And I added in the little box in the top left, heat dome and atmospheric rivers. This is terminology that is relatively new or relatively has become relevant in the public domain recently. And that heat dome and atmospheric river hit British Columbia over, the last couple of years. The heat dome led to one of those fires I identified right at the beginning, where the town of Linton was literally burnt to a crisp. And that was subsequently followed by the atmospheric river, which drenched British Columbia, the Rocky Mountains, and washed away major, major bridges. And if you haven't had a chance to take a look at what happened there, it is an experience that the world needs to become aware of, because that is that dark cloud on the horizon that I had showed earlier. These 2 slides, the one on the right, is one that was in the Senator's presentation, and basically it identifies economic impact. If you do not proactively approach adaptation, those kinds of expenses are going to be there annually, country by country by country, it adds up. If you take a proactive approach, and that's shown on the slide on the left, if you take any infrastructure and you take some money and put some adaptive actions in there, you build the resilience. Everything that we've been talking about from top down, and the benefit of that is it minimizes the economic impact and it minimizes the disruption to the people who that infrastructure provides. It's about the people. So if you're going to start considering doing adaptive actions to infrastructure, what do practitioners need to consider? And this is a whole non-engineering related approach. You have to know what the risk tolerance of your infrastructure is, of your community is. What can you afford? How much damage can you do? If you're considering risk tolerance from a perspective of impact, fatalities, there is no risk tolerance. It should be zero. But there might be some, we can buy insurance for some of this, and if there's damages within your limits of insurance. You have to know what a catastrophic failure looks like for each of those infrastructures. You have to know what the resilience, adaptive capacity and resilience is for your infrastructure. When engineers design these things, they put safety factors in because they didn't know. There was uncertainty, so they put safety factors. Does that safety factor give you a little bit of a buffer in your consideration of resilience? Again, on the life cycle status, I had touched on that earlier. The changing climate projections on extreme events and design parameters, building codes. The improvement in design criteria, information, and climate from the first time I sat at this table to now has been tremendous. The climate scientists and those providing climate services have done a very, very good job. Better communication needs to be done on that. Better service needs to be done specifically in the developing world. Data relevance and limitations. Infrastructure that was built in the past, sometimes the records aren't up to date, sometimes there's no records. So how do you deal with it? You bring the best, most knowledgeable people to the table, and you make the best judgments you can on the data you have. And this means bringing the operators and maintainers, the people that get up every day and go to work and make sure that that service is provided. They know where the weak links are because they've seen it. There's been storms. They know where there's flooding. They know where there's been washouts. These are the weakest links, and that's usually where your catastrophic failures start. They have to be at the table, and all facets, perspectives have to be taken into account. And then you can't forget about the impacts on society and the economic impacts, as I touched on. So you have to consider all these things within addressing vulnerability assessments. Vulnerability assessments on every infrastructure, especially critical infrastructures, should be done. And they should be done using established and proven protocols and tools, and they should be done, any adaptive action should be done maintaining acceptable levels of service. So, systemic approach to basically what I just said, define risk tolerance, catastrophic failure, access those tools and train knowledgeable people to use the tools, capacity development, especially important in the developing world, require engineering vulnerability assessments on all new and critical existing infrastructures, implement adaptation actions to build that resilience into the system. The bottom line, we need teams of skilled and knowledgeable practitioners working with the owners to mitigate the impacts of a changing climate. The good news is here. Those people are in place, Every infrastructure has got operators and maintainers that go to work every day making sure it's working. They need the tools, they need the knowledge, and they need the support. So, in summary, implementing adaptive action requires the elements, and this just summarizes what I've just been taking. Skilled team, focused training, best quality information, specific training on assessment protocols. Pivc is the one I was involved with and started, was fortunate enough to chair in 2005. And then you need the governance. You need the support of the governance, whether it's local, regional, national, or global. So with that, I thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Darrel. And, you know, again, yet another good presentation. And I two takeaways that, goodness me, they are not really comforting. The first one is about codes and standards that, you know, they take time to take into consideration climate resilience. And then when I think that the life of infrastructure we are building now, the life is going to be 25 to 100 years, there's a double gap on climate resilience that we are actually having in place in all our infrastructures that are built right now. And the other one is we are all aware of the concept of system of systems because effectively we are all interconnected and the infrastructure is not different. They are all interconnected. So effectively the failure of one is going to bring the failure of the system. So I never thought about the failure of failures. It's not just the system of systems. So these are the food for thought that I got from your presentation. Really good, really good. The next one is going to be the last one for this panel, and it's going to be given by David Lapp, who is here present with a beautiful quintessential Canadian shirt that we are all going to enjoy in a moment. He is going to speak on the behalf of Erik Sparling from the Climate Risk Institute. David is senior advisor of the Pivc program that Darrel just introduced, and has had a career of nearly 20 years in consulting engineering. David joined Engineers Canada in 1997, and since assumed a variety of roles at Engineers Canada in international affairs, engineering qualifications, and guidelines related to engineering practice. In this capacity, David supported the development, implementation, and ongoing program support for the Pivc Protocol, a process to assess infrastructure climate risks and vulnerabilities. Between 2007 and 2015, David served as the secretary of the WFEO Committee on Engineering and Environment and for Engineers Canada. He continues to volunteer on the committee as Engineers Canada representative. David is a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineers and a fellow of Engineers Canada. David, please come to the stage.
Hello, everyone. So I'm being very patriotic today by wearing this shirt that has lots of maple leafs on it. So just instead of a suit. So yes. So I'm presenting on behalf of Erik Sparling. As mentioned, he sends his regrets. He would have loved to have been here, but I'm here in his place. And I am a senior advisor to the Climate Risk Institute. So I'm know much of what their work does, and you'll see some of that in this presentation. So this talk really deals with the how of adapting infrastructure to climate change, and really the objective being to reduce and wherever possible eliminate loss and damage, which of course is a very big theme in this conference and going forward. And really what we're saying in our approach here is that if you understand the risks that the climate imposes on your infrastructure, both now, under current climate, and in the future, that you can indeed adapt to mitigate the greatest risks and therefore reduce your loss and damage and making your infrastructure, more resilient. So I just want to give a concept around what this all means, because we need to understand the consequences of climate impacts on infrastructure. And Darrel touched on this in a number of ways, but when it comes down to a sort of a formalized view of it here, you can see that engineers design to a certain a load, shall we say. So you have there the forecast capacity of the forecast load. Now, when you have extreme weather events and climate events, you can see here in this slide that depending on the extent or the level of the climate impact, you can have a greater loss and damage to your infrastructure. So if you have a much greater, shall we say, climate parameter, that can lead to the loss of the asset, or it can be, degraded service. So there's different levels of sort of impact from different climate thresholds. And this is important because this links the climate to the consequence. And of course, there's all these different possibilities of loss and damage, which are listed on this slide. And so the conclusion is that different climate thresholds lead to different levels of damage or loss outcomes. So how do we deal with this? Well, when you're trying to figure out the climate thresholds, this really is a probability of occurrence. So you have on the bottom line here a probability of occurrence. It could be a scale, it could be a set of numbers. And on the left side there is the consequence you saw there, where different levels of loss and damage. And so you have increasing scales. And what this refers to is really what was referred to, as Darrel said, risk assessment. So what happens here is that you have a flood that perhaps has a low probability but has a high consequence. But as a result of climate change, where that flood now increases in its frequency, because as we were saying, you have increased frequency of extreme events, and that is being caused by climate change more and more going forward. For the next 25 to 100 years over the life cycle of the infrastructure, it's going to see more and more of this kind of thing happening. And what in a risk assessment environment, or shall we say process, that flood now is shifted to become a high risk. And therefore, the idea being that through adaptation, you're going to reduce that risk to a lower level. And that's where the risk tolerance comes in. How low do you want to make that risk? And how much are you prepared to pay for that? Because if you wanted to reduce the risk of that flood to zero, it will cost you probably an infinite number of dollars. So it's going to have to be something probably less than that. But you can use this framework to kind of evaluate what you want to do, because once you've identified your highest risks, there's where you can put your money to make sure that the risk is reduced, and so forth. So how have we done this in Canada in particular, and now more and more internationally? You heard the acronym Pivc, and in Canada we developed what we call the Pivc Protocol, and that has been was under development between 2005 and 2012. So we've had 10 years of experience on top of the development period with this protocol. And really it is to inform actions that should be taken, both engineering, shall we say structural and non-structural measures, to reduce loss and damage, because then you know your greatest vulnerabilities. And really what you're trying to do is to obviously assess for loss and damage, but also as engineers we have a duty to have infrastructures that are safe, and also provide a level of service for the people that use the infrastructures. And so what this information does, it informs decisions on how, what to adapt and how. And as I mentioned, we've got extensive use of this in Canada, and we have also extended it internationally, which I'll explain briefly a little bit later. In addition to sort of the specifics around infrastructure assessment, there's different other needs for assessing risks. And one of them is when you need to do a fairly quick job around, I need to know my risks like within weeks or perhaps a couple of months rather than perhaps a few months. So we developed a higher level screening guide that's mentioned, and I'll talk briefly about that a little bit later. Also, if you want to look at your portfolio, so if you have like a bunch of assets across your country that are of a similar kind of asset, or perhaps a community where you've got, a water treatment plant, you've got roads, you've got buildings. So these are what we call portfolios. We have a methodology to handle that. We've also are in the process of building a green and natural infrastructure risk assessment tool. We're doing that in cooperation with one of our partners I'll mention a little bit later, GIZ. And you can actually look at, how to plan what you need to do with respect to assessing risk and so forth. And the last part is developing local capacity. So the idea here in our program has been, this isn't just about some kind of tool. You need to have the people that have the knowledge and experience in applying the tool and using the results to make meaningful decisions. So there's a whole aspect of this program I'll again go into briefly around developing local capacity, and that's extremely important in all areas of the world. So the protocol itself, I'll just briefly go through to say that it was developed by Engineers Canada in cooperation with the Canadian government, and through a committee it was developed that was chaired by Darrel, and I was the secretary and the project manager for it. We put together a cross-section of experts that were both involved in infrastructure from the engineering point of view, the ownership point of view, also from the government point of view. And we put together this tool that would help engineers and now other practitioners, planners and so forth, to plan out and then implement adaptation actions to reduce loss and damage. And it's applied, it uses a team approach. So it's not just about engineers. We need climate scientists. We need the operators and maintainers. We need planners. We need policy folks. So it's a process that involves multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder. And as I was mentioning before, we have done a lot in Canada, but we've also, in the earlier days, we worked with, through the World Federation with Costa Rica and Honduras, and then most recently in the last few years with GIZ in a climate services for infrastructure investment project where we extended that now to Brazil, Costa Rica, Vietnam, and the Nile Basin. And this work was funded by the German government, and so we have a partnership going on. The Climate Risk Institute is working with GIZ now to further this work. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just to say there is actually this isn't just vaporware. We actually have a series of steps that are undertaken, that are documented and explained, several steps that in step 3 result in a risk assessment. And then what do you do with that risk profile? You then use it to develop conclusions and recommendations about how to adapt. So that starts the discussion. It isn't necessarily the end of it, but there's certainly a report that gives you the risk profile. And then we have an additional module which can evaluate adaptation options from a sustainability perspective, the 3 pillars, economic, social, and environmental. So that's an additional module within the protocol. But this is all available in documentation, and as I say, it's been developed and refined over many, many years. We've done with the protocol more than 120 assessments in Canada. You can see the broad categories of infrastructure that it's been applied to. We haven't found an infrastructure yet that it can't be applied to successfully. And we've also our federal government now is embarked in a multi-year program to evaluate all of their infrastructures that they own as a federal government, different departments, using the protocol. And there's actually a website where you can actually have these reports. Part of the principle of the program is to make this information as freely and openly available. So you can see these reports on a website that's listed there. The other thing with the international work is we've translated the protocol now into several languages with the assistance of GIZ. We have it in French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Vietnamese. So, and it's always possible we're open to into other languages, but we've really recognized the international application of the protocol. The protocol, as was mentioned before, was developed by Engineers Canada when I was there at Engineers Canada, and I was operating the program. And in March 2020, the program was divested to a group that includes Climate Risk Institute, GIZ, and another group called the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, which is a research organization based in Toronto that is an arm of the insurance community in Canada. And one of the things under this transfer, shall we say, divestment, is the principles of operation, which are important to review here because we're hopeful that some of you may consider using this protocol going forward, or at least benefit from what we've done to date. And that is, it's a free protocol. So it's not, we don't have you don't have to pay for it. It's freely available, and you just register through the website. We also have a principle of disseminating the information. So we put reports as much as we can on the website. Sometimes we can't because people want the results to be confidential, and we have to respect that. As I mentioned, some of the formats and uses of tools, which I'll briefly go into in a moment. And the other aspect is capacity building. So we have training programs and resources to support people to get knowledgeable about the tool and apply it. And we're in the process of forming practitioner networks, both in Canada and internationally through GIZ. And there's a global, with the objective of a global reach. We started with the countries I've mentioned, but we're hoping to go to other countries as well. And just on the lower right corner is the main website for this particular program. So if you start there, you'll be able to get lots of information about the protocol and the projects that have been completed. In addition to the main protocol, we also have, as I mentioned before, the high-level screening guide, which is now available also for use. And we have the large portfolio assessment manual that's shown on the right. And the one on the right has been applied, for example, in Brazil, where they have looked at, they originally looked at a port, and they're now have expanded that to looking at 21 ports. So they're kind of scaling it up, and I think it's even more than that now. 61. Okay, pardon me, I got my number wrong. But the point is that they're looking at this in a portfolio type of approach, identifying the most vulnerable ports, and then can apply the more detailed protocol process to those ones instead of having to do it 61 times, right? Last part of the presentation, just to talk about adaptive capacity, because I think this is an extremely important element of what's needed, not just for a tool like this, but in general. I think, and we've had a lot of experience with this, and we're certainly still learning as to how to do it, because there's many target audiences that you're wanting to speak to and talk to about, implementing these things. But first of all, one of the most important at the beginning is, of course, building awareness. So talks like this, and we've been coming here for more than 10 years to explain this protocol because it's been around that long, but to build awareness. And it's not just for engineers, but also the folks that operate and manage infrastructure, and to really show the need, the rationale, and the benefits of doing this kind of work. Then you get into things like on-site workshops, or e-learning. With COVID, we've had a lot of virtual workshops, that sort of thing. And the other, I think, most important and most effective is learn by doing. When you're writing out a new technique and you're trying to bring it into your environment, the best way to do this is just try it out. Like do a pilot project and get the folks involved, and then they can learn as they're going along, and with coaching and support from folks that are involved, say, in the program. Of course, there's continuing education, professional development. That can lead to identification of a set of credential or certification, and we're working on that at the moment. And one of the other things about this tool, I think, is we're really emphasizing linkages to other kinds of processes that are used. There's a whole area called asset management, and so you want to feed those climate risks into asset management, which is looking at that 25 to 100 year span of how to manage assets. And so climate risks are part of that decision-making process. And then lastly, I'll just mention the institutionalizing of this kind of work, We talked about codes and standards. There's also the mandating of this kind of thing through policy, legislation, and also procurement practices. So just give you a couple of quick examples of the international applications, and we have a friend here in the audience who I'll call upon in a moment to talk about this. But this, we've probably had our longest history of involvement internationally with Costa Rica. We started back in 2009, and through the GIZ project, we actually did an application for a bridge called the Laguardia Bridge, which was experiencing a serious flood event and is an aging bridge. And the idea is, the question was, should we replace this bridge, or should we, maintain it and look at it in the context of climate change? So this was the project that was done. We applied the protocol. During the application of the protocol, we did a lot of. So if you kind of go underneath the picture there, we did a lot of on-site training, and we executed the protocol through workshops and so forth. Came up with a report. This actually, so there's specific recommendations around what to do with this bridge going forward with climate change, but it also had influence on things like policies. There's a presidential decree on climate proofing that was informed by the results of this project and a couple of other applications that were done in Costa Rica. And it's also had an influence on the National Adaptation Plan of Costa Rica. So it actually can percolate. This gives you kind of the evidence to justify and to propose. It's evidence-based policy here that's being put together. And I'd like to call upon my friend here from Costa Rica. Maybe you could say a few words, introduce yourself, and just talk a little bit from your perspective. I'm telling you about this, but it's always good to hear from somebody who is involved in the application. So please come up and have a seat here. You can go on the mic.
Yes, thank you. Hello, my name is Ivan Delgado. I'm from Costa Rica, and I have just a few words. First of all, I have to say thank you. Thank you, David, thank you, Darrel, engineers, Canadien, for support our country to building capacities. Thank you, GSI, Benjamin, and all the people they are working with us to make this a real protocol right now, a real methodology. We have applied Pivc in various infrastructures in Costa Rica, and today we have better knowledge. We need to talk about the access to the climate services. The engineers have to take the best data. Right now we have to work for the best data, and they need to use the future and the information of the climate change in our countries. They have to use it for the new designs. Our infrastructure is not about resilient infrastructure. It is about ensuring the continuity of green, blue, and green services helps the resilience of the community and reduce the loss and damage. For us, we have to work for the green infrastructure. We have to talk about the blue infrastructure, not only the green infrastructure. The ecosystems help to protect the hard infrastructure. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You are a best friend to Costa Rica. Thank you so much.
And that's the way we like to do it. We like to have the users talk about their experiences rather than us talking about this all the time. So that's been our approach for many years. The other one I just want to briefly touch on, and again, kind of a similar process, but this was really neat because this was an infrastructure that was still in design. It had not been built yet, and it's a sluice gate in Vietnam. And again, we worked with a team in Vietnam GIZ, ourselves, and part of that process was to apply the protocol, did the training in a similar approach to what was done in Costa Rica, and then they actually used that to adjust the design of the sluice gate based on climate risks that they were expected to have from this analysis. So that was really, really neat to actually be able to influence the design. And that sluice structure is now constructed and is now operating. Up in the upper right corner is what it is. And I would love to go back there myself to actually see it, because the time I went, it didn't exist in this river. And the purpose of the sluice gate is to mitigate the intrusion of salt water into their, regular water, because it's a big agriculture area in the Mekong Delta, right? And what has gone on with that, in addition to the actual analysis of the risks, was a cost-benefit analysis of the adaptation measures. So they evaluated this further from that point of view. And they've now extended that analysis to 81 other existing sluice gates. So again, it's taking the initial results and propagating that to see what the other impacts are on other infrastructures. Now, I'll quickly go through the last 2 or 3 slides here. One is to say that, again, building capacity. The Climate Risk Institute offers a credential called the Infrastructure Resilience Professional, and it consists of completing 6 courses that are listed here. And completing all those courses leads to a credential that's issued. It's a formal course. And I guess one of my message there is, of course, the credential is one thing, but if there's a particular course topic that is of interest, that's also possible, and they can deliver this internationally. So if there's interest in any of these, that's definitely something that can be arranged. Not only is it for practitioners and engineers, shall we say, they've also got a set of courses for planners, so the planning profession, and they've got, again, modules that lead to a recognition of completing a body of knowledge that is for planners. So again, these are the different modules and the topics and relevant to planners. And lastly, just to talk about the global network. So we're proposing and organizing a global network of Pivc practitioners. This is being organized by GIZ and the Climate Risk Institute to be launched, where we bring together folks to talk about projects and details and so forth. So more details to come on that. And I will end my presentation just to say thank you. And here's the contact information for Erik. If you have any questions about the courses or the protocol, and Darrel and I are continue to be involved with both GIZ and Climate Risk Institute. So thank you very much.
I would invite everybody to come on the stage of this panel, because I think that, clearly I'm biased, but it was a very good session. We had very high-level contributions from the Honourable Senator, and then we saw what happens in practice when we are talking about climate change adaptation in the infrastructure sector and in engineering. Now, before we start the debate among us, I'm just double-checking that, there are questions or there are no questions from the virtual audience, no questions from the virtual audience, and whether there is any question from you, real audience, or comment, any contribution you feel like making. Right. And if not, we trigger a little bit the debate among us. So, I think that it was pretty clear that effectively the level of knowledge that we need to apply on resilience is quite detailed, is quite strong. It can be to a sector, like the water sector. It can be to a very, bespoke projects, like in the case of Costa Rica and Vietnam. But there was one question I had for all the three of you, when in your likelihood and matrix about adaptation to reduce the impact of an event in the resilience side, clearly there must be an intervention. And I was thinking about the conundrum between lower capex and resilience. So in infrastructure sector in engineering, what the tendency is to spend as less as possible now because of lots of different reasons. Because expenditures usually are very big. They may come from private or public sector, and we are very stretched in the finance right now, more than ever. So my question for the panel was, based on your experience, how can we overcome this conundrum of lower capex versus resilience in the future? Sorry, I'll start with a very easy question.
Well, I'm going to take the first shot at answering that, and I think an easy solution is to ensure that in all procurement there's a triple bottom line analysis of the submissions for the call for designs as well as the construction. Triple bottom line means it's not just economic lowest price. You have to take into account the environmental and social factors. And it shouldn't be the lowest price because you're building infrastructure, and as I said before, for the people. You want to minimize the impact on them. So triple bottom line from my perspective.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, maybe we must build step by step. I mean, not everything at once, you know. Maybe we cannot build infrastructures that last 100 years. From that perspective, we must build infrastructure that can resist 100 years, but build it step by step. First, we're going to build infrastructure that can resist 20 years, another 20, and so on, I guess.
I would just add, in addition, that part of the resilience of infrastructure relates to its operation and its maintenance. So you want to make sure that you're maintaining your infrastructure over that period. And it's always trying to find a sweet spot between how much you design and how much you put on operation and maintenance. But you know, if you can build an infrastructure, but if it only lasts 5 years, what's the value there? You need to make sure that that continues to operate and be maintained to the way it was intended. That does take money on a year-to-year basis, but it actually preserves your asset over its life.
Right. Wow. This triggered a lot of discussion. I think there are 3 questions or comments from the audience, and I'm wondering whether we can share a microphone. Yeah.
Very interesting discussions about getting this infrastructure through the changing climate. And of course, in some territories, of course, you already have the infrastructure in place while the climate, the changing climate is ongoing. So I'd like to get your thoughts or ideas about how do we go about, one, of course, deciding whether to maintain and operate the infrastructure as it is in the face of a changing climate. When it was designed, it wasn't really built for a changing climate. The second question is, how do you think about the need to, I don't know, I'm just deriving it from the seismic or earthquake engineering field, where we do retrofitting in order to suit a certain level of risk. Would that be applicable as well to climate compromised infrastructure? Infrastructure in general.
Yeah,
what do you think about this?
I thought my question was difficult.
I think I made a mistake by being first last time. 2 questions. The retrofit question is more difficult, so I'm going to go with the first one first, which I think you're talking about a life cycle. And where are you in the life cycle? And then you need to do the analysis of what the impacts are and what the damages are going to be. Again, using something like the Pivc with some kind of assessment. So If it's early in the life cycle, very likely it's retrofit, build more capacity. As you get closer to the end of the life cycle, you're going to be faced with needing to say, are we prepared to take the risk of a catastrophic failure, yes or no? And if it's yes, then you have to find out what you can do to just extend the life until you rebuild. The other one is, if I understood it correctly, is using the climate risk assessment protocols applicable to other risks and threats to infrastructure. And the answer to that is yes, and there's some people that are already looking at it. The protocol is really basic engineering, making engineers going back to basics, understanding all the criteria as it exists, not relying on codes and standards. You look at the codes and standards, you understand the codes and standards, you understand what was used when they designed it. But it's bringing together knowledgeable people and doing really good engineering and coming to their conclusion. Okay.
Yeah, I think we run into this in terms of like for a retrofitting decision. Really, to optimize that is understand your risks. You know, do a risk assessment and determine like what are your weakest links and what the nature of those might be, like what climate factor is causing that, and then look at engineering solutions and other, as we say, non-structural solutions to reduce that. And it could be retrofitting. It could be sometimes it's a change in procedure. We've seen in some of our assessments that, like, for example, inspecting something, like if you haven't looked at something for 10 years, chances are, there's probably some issues. So we've found that some cities in Canada have actually said, well, we need to look at this every 3 years because we had a failure here and we failed to detect that there was blockages and had been deteriorated, right? So that's just an example. So sometimes it's costs money, retrofit. Sometimes it's not necessarily a huge thing, but if you're looking at this from a risk point of view and you find your weakest links, those are where you can prioritize your efforts.
First, thank you so much for the different presentation. My question is a tricky question, so I'm already sorry for the question. As you know, there are native communities in Canada that must adapt their lifestyle to the climate change. I was wondering first if you have ever worked with native communities in Canada, and how can we, more in general, help the communities that have a non-sedentary life in order to help them adapt with respecting their lifestyle. Maybe a last question. In your different organization, do you define, have you got a particular definition for vulnerable groups? And otherwise, how do you choose the groups you're going to work with? Okay.
Well, I'll take a shot at answering the first one. So the answer to the Indigenous peoples, First Nations in Canada, the answer is yes. They're actually an associate of the Pivc group that David talked about. They have taken Pivc and they've customized it to apply to their communities, and they're doing the training with their people. So that was a great question because it really is an example of the success of this. Now, at my age, I have trouble remembering. You talked about the
the fact that people are probably not living in the same place all the time. I don't know.
Oh, okay. I understand what you're saying.
Settling people.
I'm not aware of any work that's been done with them. But answering your question, how do we choose who we work with? anybody who's interested in learning, getting involved, we're happy to work with. So if there's somebody from that community or somebody with an NGO from that community that would be interested in seeing if there is an applicable way forward. In Costa Rica, the work in Costa Rica started because of a relationship. The relationship led to getting funding, doing a pilot study, and then building that great success story that was there. So we're happy to talk to you about that to fully understand exactly what could be done in that area.
Maybe I could add one other thing, which is that in the process itself of identifying risks and ranking what they are, we talked about the fact that we need to have a bunch of people at the table. So a lot of times, in a city or whatever, you're going to have the engineers, the planners, say the operators, maintainers. But we've had, other services like police services, we've had emergency services, and we've also had politicians. So these are representatives of the people, because if you want to get that perspective and add that to your consideration of the risks, pardon me. So citizens can also get involved in that process. I mean, there's nothing to exclude them from a process of including them. It's just a matter of scoping that out. So that is one way the process can engage at that level.
And this is working. Maybe I can provide an answer to your third point about how do we consider vulnerable groups. And you may remember one of the slides I shared was about the climate emergency declaration. And what was quintessential in that declaration was the principle of leaving no one behind. And therefore, as David said, that gives the scope to consider all the vulnerable groups for each of the member country, because what we did was asking each of the member country of WFEO to adapt that one and definitely to identify the vulnerable groups. But was very much quintessential there, present in identifying the high-level group, that maybe they are similar to the constituencies of the UNFCCC, but then to go much more into the granular analysis, country by country, asking the member organization to look at that.
Thank you very much for the panelists for the great presentations. I'm Chiang Wong, working and studying at RWTH Aachen University in the chair of urban planning and traffic planning. And my question is, how do you streamline those knowledges to the universities that we, also here in the EU or the Global South University, get knowledge to this, what you have assessed, so that the education is early aware and get the knowledge of this climate resilience infrastructure?
I'll have a shot at this one. Excuse me. So absolutely, that is an extension. You might say that those courses that I was showing for the different things, those are, one might say, continuing education or professional development. So the CRI does the delivery of that, but there's nothing to stop it from being done at an institutional level. So, and we've also been advocating for programs like engineering programs to bring some of this knowledge and have it be taught, say at the undergraduate or graduate level. And we have a few spot examples in Canada of that happening, but not systematically. So if that's something of interest, I would suggest that you contact Erik and say, hey, is there possibilities here for us to collaborate, in delivering this material, through your institution perhaps? I don't see, on first glance, I would say, hey, that makes sense, right, to get this around the world. So I'd contact Erik with that question, and he'll get back to you with, consulting his team.
And can I just add to that That question was great insight. When PIVC was first conceived, it was visualized that within 30 years, it would be embedded in education, it would be embedded in those people that go to work every day. It becomes a way of thinking. And if we can do that in engineering, we can do that in planning, we can get it into policy, then we can deal with all these issues related to climate. And grassroots development education is a very strong piece there.
And then if I can just add to this, I think you touched a very important point. Of course, I left engineering a few years ago, but I wanted to keep in touch with the academia. And I think that there's still a gap to fill between academia, what is taught and learned and discussed in academia, institutions of engineering, and what happens in reality. Because effectively we've been talking quite a lot about retrofitting, resilience, adaptability, reusing existing assets, extending life of assets, and so on. And traditionally in academia, we learn how to build stuff, not how to what to do with existing stuff. So I think that we need to close this gap by all means, by bringing these kind of real issues into the academia, where, of course, the basics of engineering must be learned, but equally they need to you know, prepare engineers for what they're going to find and potentially to push the envelope to progress in the discussion rather than catching up. So I think, Ignacio, I don't know whether you had anything on this? Okay. I think we've been asked to wrap up this session. First of all, thanking all the presenters here in person, and also the Honourable Senator Rosa Galvez, that unfortunately couldn't be here with us today. Thanking all of you for the questions and the debate. It's been a real pleasure to discuss much more into the nitty-gritty what's going on in the engineering community and the resilience one as well. And I think as a last thought, I go back to what I said before. This is a session at the UNFCCC about engineering, and we are representing the engineering community. And so I would suggest to think a little bit about the role that engineers have in climate resilience, because as we learned today once more, it's all about people. And you know, engineers, they've been sometimes struggling to understand this, but I think, again, we are catching up in thinking about the social dimension, the societal dimension. But equally, the society is struggling in recognizing what engineering can do to bring resilience in our society. So I think we need to build this bridge of knowledge, people, and projects where actually we are going to achieve resilient societies across the world. In saying this, I thank you, all of you, and I look forward to working more closely with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.